this school, the Spanish language and Latino cultures aren't something that are just on the side. They're very much at the center of what happens here, reflecting the reality of not just this community, but the U.S. Catholic Church.
Bishop Kakanis in America Magazine just argued that it drives migrants into more remote regions.
Thank God I didn't get out before I changed, because I feel like I might have done the same thing again.
A global church. We're a church that goes to the margins. We're a church that really reaches out to all. The church in general, and especially Catholic schools, should really dare to innovate and to try new things.
Good evening, everyone. On behalf of our president, Dr. Eugene Cornacchia, and the entire St. Peter's University family of faculty, staff, administration, and our amazing student body, and our beautiful university church and parish, St. Aidan's, I, Father Rocco, welcome you to this evening and to this inspiring moment. One little note, perhaps, given the theme of this evening, this conversation. St. Peter's is recognized as a leader in New Jersey of educating Latino students. Why not? Over 40% of our student body is Latino. Additionally, our university church, St. Aidan's, has a very large Latino population, and our Spanish Mass is one of our largest. So it is very right, wonderful, that we're here tonight and having this conversation together. Again, I welcome you. And now, to the podium, I welcome JD.
Thanks, Father Rocco. Yeah, I'll just be speaking from here. It's a very comfortable chair, so I figure I'll just stay just right where I am. But thank you very much for that introduction. I'd also want to give special thanks to Father John Hyatt, who's here with us, and the St. Aidan's University Church community for your support. Father Rocco and Christine Boyle and the entire St. Peter's University community here, and it's just a perfect place to be having this conversation, I think, given the diversity that we find here at St. Peter's, and really in a way like how St. Peter's is an exemplification of a culture of encounter, and the education that students receive here, not only in classes but from each other. They really do encounter people from all different kinds of cultures here. So it's a great blessing to be able to have this conversation here on this campus. And I also want to make sure to thank David Miranda and the Hudson County Latino Foundation for all your help promoting this event among your contacts and your resources. So thank you very much for all of that. It's my honor to be moderating this panel with three very gifted panelists whose work is an admiration and really an inspiration to all of us, but to me, and how you guys have dedicated your lives to the Latino community and to helping the Latino community. We have Valentina Morales with us. She's a senior director at Justice of Justice Initiatives with the Fedcap Group. And we also have Stephanie Macias-Arlington, the Executive Director of the Joseph A. Unanue Latino Institute at Seton Hall University. They let you in here anyway, despite being from a different university. And Michelle Mendez, Director of the Defending Vulnerable Populations Program at the Catholic Legal Immigration Network. So thank you very much for being here on this panel. And as you noticed from the video that we began with, this is part of the Church America's, the Church in America initiative, and we're exploring the emerging Latino church that's really already here, where we have so many people that are part of the church that have a Latino background. So we're doing that specifically through the three topics that we'll be addressing today: immigration, Latinos and Catholic education, and criminal justice reform. And you really could have separate panels just on each one of those three issues, and we did as part of the initiative already. Not here at St. Peter's, but in different parts of the country, from San Antonio and Los Angeles and Washington, D.C., and way over in New York, just across the river here. It was when we kicked this series of 5 events off. So this is the closing event here, and it's been a great honor to be a part of it myself. So it's a great blessing to be a part of it and to be a part of this. So Michelle, I just want to ask all of you to tell us a little bit more about your work, so that as we ask questions later of you, we have a kind of a background for that. So you'll be given a chance, you guys that are here present, will be given a chance to ask your own questions. If you don't like mine, you can ask your own. And BYOQ, kind of thing. So, and then also there'll be a chance for, we'll be taking questions from online. So if you're watching online, you have a question for our panelists, we want to hear your question. And especially thoughtful questions that are going to move the conversation along, because that's what this is all about having a conversation about these issues. So great. So Michelle, could you tell us a little bit more about what you do?
Of course, and good evening, everyone. So as JD mentioned, I am the Director of Defending Vulnerable Populations Program at Clinic. And this is actually a new program at Clinic. And the reason it's fairly new is because it was created in response to the more recent policies that have taken place against immigrants, and really have hurt a lot of immigrants and separated families and done a lot of the things that are currently in the media, right? And so we produce a large amount of practice advisory guides and the more nuanced type of materials for legal practitioners, whether they're attorneys or accredited representatives, as they're called in immigration law. So it's somebody who's a non-attorney who can actually practice immigration law if they're accredited by the Department of Justice. We provide trial skills trainings to these legal representatives, because most people who go to law school who want to do this important work of helping immigrants really are kind of social workers at heart. But they never get that training during law school unless they decided, okay, I'm going to go do trial team or moot court, and then they come out and they don't have these skills. And right now, under the Trump administration, immigration court has become extremely adversarial. There's no prosecutorial discretion. That was wiped out. So we don't have the trial attorneys for Department of Homeland Security saying we're going to do some prosecutorial discretion. So aside from that, we also have innovative programs as to how to respond to the legal needs. So we were part of the CARA Pro Bono project in Dilley, Texas, in response to family detention. We are part of the national network of responding to separated families and how to help them, and working with our large network of nonprofit providers locally. So we support our nonprofit affiliates in our network to provide better representation, the best representation possible, affordable representation for the immigrant community who can't pay thousands of dollars for competent representation. So that's what our network does, and that's what we're here to do, to assist them and support them. But our work really goes beyond that, because we have a lot of private attorneys who also depend on our resources. And we do a lot of other things that I won't get into right now, but the other thing that I will say is that we're also engaging in federal litigation, because under this administration, that's the one thing that seems to actually make an impact. And so we've now started partnering with our affiliates on the ground to bring up litigation in federal courts.
That's great. There sure is a lot of things that you're doing, and maybe it's worth mentioning. Is it Clinic Legal?
Catholic Legal Immigration Network.
Oh, no, sorry, the website. Is what I'm
Oh,
saying.
yes, the website, yes, cliniclegal.org.
Okay,
Yes,
just in
thank
case you don't remember, you haven't committed that to memory immediately. That you could go to the website and find out a lot more details. And I use the website a lot, actually, as a reporter, because it's very easy to navigate the different resources that they have there. And if you're a person that needs those resources, I'd be sure to visit the website. And Stephanie, can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing at Seton Hall?
Sure. Thank you again for the opportunity to address everyone. The Joseph A. Unanue Latino Institute exists on the campus of Seton Hall University. We serve the entire campus community, predominantly the Latino student community. But in fact, we've been serving students at Seton Hall in this capacity since 1974 as the Puerto Rican Institute. We serve students with English learning training, with stipends for books and for tuition, and then in 2005, Joseph and Carmen Ana Unanue, Joseph being the former CEO and chairman of Goya Foods, made a gift to create the endowment and to really enhance the services that the Institute provides. It is our mission to advance, educate, and transform the Latino students on campus so that they're prepared for the workforce, they're compassionate in their service for others. Servant leadership is one of our mottos at Seton Hall University, and we hope that they're fiercely proud of their Latino heritage. We do that by a combination of cultural programming. We invite cultural icons, political figures, leading Latino thoughts leaders to campus. For example, we are thrilled to share that Dolores Huerta will be joining us in the fall. And so this is an opportunity for our student and the community to be educated on Latino themes, the nuances of our culture, language, and again, to learn more about who we are as a people.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that with us. And Valentina, can you tell us what?
Sure, and I also want to thank you for inviting me to be here and have this conversation with everyone. So I am the Senior Director of Justice Initiatives at an organization called Fedcap, with a very long history of assisting individuals with barriers to accessing economic stability and mobility. It's an organization that was founded by veterans. Among the populations that we serve are, in fact, veterans, those with criminal justice involvement, people of various abilities, including those with IDD. And what I do at Fedcap is essentially to advise on criminal justice initiatives. I created and currently direct a program called the Women's Project, which is an alternative to pretrial detention program for women who don't qualify for existing programming in New York City, as an effort to assist in bringing down the population in the city jail and closing our city jail, which is Rikers Island. I'm very happy to be here. Prior to coming to Fedcap, I'm an attorney by trade, so I bring to this conversation the advocacy that I have done in the past on behalf of those who are incarcerated and those who are involuntarily committed to psychiatric hospitals.
It's very difficult with this conversation to know exactly where to begin. There's a lot of overlap between these topics, but since it's been in the news lately, Michelle, I think that it might be useful to talk a little bit about the condition in detention centers right now.
Yes, absolutely. So it's really, interesting, I guess, is the word, but it's not really interesting. It shouldn't be interesting. It should even be happening that, we have these conditions of detention that are present both in the criminal justice system, which Valentina knows about very well, and that we're seeing them too in immigration detention. And I think a lot of Americans don't realize that immigration is 100% civil, right? So those who are detained in essentially jails, they are there on civil immigration violations. And yet we treat people in this way, right? And we're seeing the situation with children, and that we just came to the news, and how they're being treated despite the Flores Agreement. So it's in violation of the law, in violation of the Flores Agreement, that we see that even children are subjected to these conditions. But before that, we would get emails from the Department of Homeland Security telling us about the latest adult man, somebody's father, brother, uncle, who passed away because he did not have good, proper care, medical care, in civil, again, immigration jail.
So, and I guess that one of the things that I've heard a lot in the media when we speak about this is that maybe making the conditions more harsh is somehow some kind of deterrent. But it really seems, on the other hand, that there isn't any reason for the conditions to be like that in the execution of justice. I mean, is that a fair?
Yes, absolutely. So first of all, it's not a deterrent. To think that it's going to be a deterrent for somebody to say, hey, I don't want to be in these conditions, in these tents, in these cages. To think that somebody's going to be deterred by that is to think that somebody is making a choice to come to the United States. They're not making a choice. I mean, they're walking here, but they feel that they don't have a choice back home. In all the country conditions reports, all the experts who are there, experts who are here, experts who were there, who document this can tell us that these conditions are definitely asylum-seeking conditions. And what this administration has done is narrowed the scope, the ability for asylum seekers to seek asylum under the law. But absolutely, to think that they would be deterred is to really not recognize these individuals as asylum seekers, and to give them the conditions that they're currently subjected to is to not see them as human beings.
And I just mentioned oftentimes when we're talking about the emerging Latino church in these conversations, a big part of the conversation is immigration, and that's very natural to think about perhaps. Myself, I was born in the Dominican Republic, so I'm an immigrant. My dad's from Chicago, so I'm a hybrid. But at the same time, when we think about like the conditions that you find in detention centers, we're talking about the detention centers for immigrants. Valentina, can you tell us a little bit more about what the detention centers are like for just in more generally speaking?
Sure. I mean, I think what's important to realize is that detention brings with it negative collateral consequences, some of which are irreversible. And any form of detention negatively impacts not only the individual being detained, but certainly the community that individual is coming from. Aside from that impact, right, which when we're talking about collateral consequences, especially in the criminal justice context, and drawing a difference too between the detained population, meaning those people who are detained pre-trial, who for the most part across this country are there because they cannot afford to pay cash bail, and even conditions for those post-sentence. I think what's important to keep in mind is that when you are detained, you inevitably don't have access to resources to preserve your housing. It can trigger collateral consequences with respect to your children, them being removed from your care. It has disparate impacts, obviously, on the individual. We, in this country, do a very good job at criminalizing trauma. We penalize poverty. And you can see that not only in the criminal justice system, in the process itself, but you can certainly see that in who is detained, for how long, and for what reasons. In jails across the country, especially as people are paying more attention to mass incarceration, because we incarcerate an astounding number of individuals, and we have been for a very long time. And as that starts to change, and it seems like that tide is turning, people are paying closer attention to the conditions of confinement, not only in the state prisons, but in the local jails, and discovering that many of them have antiquated infrastructure. They are not adequate in terms of the type of medical care that they can provide to people that need it. For women in the criminal justice system, they find themselves in a system that was created to punish men. And the impact of that system on those women who in the state prison population are one of the fastest growing populations is significant. And I think what we've kind of already mentioned is really important, is that in this country, the deprivation of liberty is the punishment. The conditions of confinement should not be an additional punishment. In the criminal justice system, when we're talking about both kind of the conditions of confinement, what that does to an individual as they re-enter into the community, the disconnect from resources, the disconnect from their life, from their family, in addition to potentially, the collateral consequences for those who are not citizens of deportation, sometimes to countries that they have not been to or can't remember going to. What does it say about us as a community and us as a society larger when we have difficulty kind of bringing ourselves, I think, collectively to the point where we can say even when people are detained, the conditions of confinement should be dignified. People should have access to medical care. And furthermore, there are alternatives to keeping people confined, to controlling their movement. And I don't know if that answers your question. There's so much to say about kind of, I think, local jails. I encourage everyone here to, if you haven't thought about this issue, to look into in your where you live, kind of what the jail looks like. It says a lot about the community that we want to be, the community that we are.
Yeah, one of the things that you said really struck me about the just the connection between poverty and the criminal justice system. And maybe I can ask you to explain that a little bit more. You talked about, like, for example, bail and not being able to afford bail. But are there other ways, other connections that you see between poverty and the criminal justice system?
Sure. I mean, there's so much research and data on this, and I mean, there's so many different ways to explain it. But poverty is an incredible indicator for incarceration. I mean, there are more people who find themselves without economic resources in the state, federal, and local criminal justice systems. It's not only an indicator of the likelihood that someone will be incarcerated, but it's also a consequence of incarceration, right? I mean, criminal convictions make it very difficult to find employment. Once you find employment, to be economically mobile. They impact the family unit. We are individuals, and as individuals, we are part, generally speaking, of units called families, and those families are part of larger units called communities. We've effectively cut the economic legs off of communities in this country, specifically the African American community, but to a large extent the Latino community as well. And with respect to bail, and this conversation is happening across the country, right? The idea that if you are someone with economic resources, you essentially can buy your freedom pre-trial is problematic, to say the least, especially when you look at the way that bail is set. And there are certainly statistics, and these can be difficult given kind of how people identify or how Latinos are identified in the system, but that demonstrate that bail is set at higher amounts for African Americans and for Latinos in the system than for their white counterparts. And not being able to pay that bail can mean the difference between, keeping your family intact, keeping your home, keeping what job you did have, and the ability to reconnect to that employment.
And then, Stephanie, I want to ask you about that, because there's maybe an obvious connection to make, but I think one we should make anyway, between poverty and education. And when you shared with us what you do and that connection to forming Latino leaders.
Latinos have had an extraordinary surge recently with college enrollment, but there's still a long way to go with rising tuition costs. If you come from an immigrant background, if you have a family that might have a mixed documented status, you might not be able to apply, and for all the acronyms that they're not familiar with, FAFSA, take your SAT and ACT scores, and getting all the financial documents in order. It's very difficult for these young men and women to move forward with their applications. And so we're hoping that higher education as a system can start to become more empathetic and holistic when they're looking at these students and the barriers to entry to access their college education. Scholarship can only go so far. We do have tuition scholarship awards at Seton Hall and other universities that can help alleviate the tuition burden, but we're hoping that, again, higher education can call on community colleges. We can talk a little bit more later. I was hoping for a conversation around the dual programming that might streamline a young student's time at a university to get their bachelor's and JD in 5-6 years rather than the longer time that it would take. And so we do understand that the students are coming with a lot of baggage. They're coming with psychological disorders. They have a lot of weight on their shoulders for thinking about the future of their families and what's the burden on their shoulders. And so again, we're just trying to be more compassionate in our service to the students and understanding that they are coming with some poverty issues, some economic undercapitalization, and they also don't have the human capital that other families that have gone to college might be able to offer their son or daughter. Access to an internship, access to a mentor, someone to look over that resume for them. And that's what we're all hoping to wrap around in our servicing.
I know there isn't a typical student per se, because all students are individual, right? I mean, when they come with their very, very different needs. But was there a student story that really illustrates that difficulty that you can share with us?
Absolutely. So before I was at Seton Hall, I was actually at NJIT, the New Jersey Institute of Technology. It's the leading STEM and engineering university here in the state of New Jersey. I worked at the incubator, the startup incubator, and it was our role to help jumpstart the economy of Newark with entrepreneurship and innovation coming out of the university. One of the great programs that we would lead is an externship program. So we would encourage students to take a job, an internship, and then gain credit from it. And I was able to meet a young man, Nicholas, who I didn't find out later was DACA. And he went into the program, he got a job, he dove right into the entrepreneurial sector. He was able to gain those soft skills that he might not have picked up in his home life. And through it, also, programming such as the Governor's Hispanic Fellows Program here in the state of New Jersey. It's run out of the State Department. Nicholas was accepted and was given the professional development training. So again, another step forward in his advancement and his soft and hard skills training. So he graduated recently with a degree from NJIT Mechanical Engineering, and then was also able to advocate down on Capitol Hill on why we should be supporting DACA students such as him. He wants to contribute to the economy. He wants to gain a job. He just wants to live like all of us do, just happy, fulfilled lives in this country. And I'm glad to say that he actually secured a job before he graduated, which is not easy in this hyper-competitive landscape, with, I think it's Bristol Myers Squibb. I was looking for the acronym for one of the pharmaceutical companies, and we're just incredibly proud of his ascension. And it's all about moving forward. It's leveraging the resourcing. We were at NJIT, the governor's office, and the fellows program, and along, even in his own community, he's from Elizabeth, and he actually drew on a number of local churches and parishes in Elizabeth for that. So you can tell it's the village mentality, it's the support. And also I want to mention, I didn't mean baggage in a negative way. It's really just a weighted effort on these students. And I felt it with Nick, and I can see that it's now, he's starting to feel more confident in his role and in advocacy and bringing forward his experiences to light.
Yeah, and it sounds like in that way, his dignity as a human being is very much being recognized.
That's exactly what it is, yep, dignity.
Yeah. The other, Valentina, if you can mention, you mentioned to me before about some of the difficulties that the people in the criminal justice system face, and of course they maintain their human dignity. As Catholics, we believe that they are people of human dignity and not always treated that way. But there are some obstacles that you shared as far as going through that system, even as far as language. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. So anyone that is limited English proficient, and in as much as in all of the courts, generally speaking, and especially in the larger cities, there is access to translation services. I think what people fail to realize, and sometimes even those who do defense, is that one, there are so many things that play into actually participating in your own defense, which have to do with not only kind of understanding the entire process, which can be difficult for individuals who are coming from a civil legal system to a common law system, where things that perhaps are fairly well established for us seem counterintuitive, and I can give you an example. Many of my clients, when I practiced criminal defense, which was quite some time ago, couldn't understand why they shouldn't speak directly to the judge, right? Why they shouldn't speak directly to the police after being arrested to negotiate a release, right? Because that's something that's fairly commonplace in their countries of origin. And so trying to advise with respect to one's right to remain silent took on not just, it wasn't complicated simply because of language, but also making sure that I was explaining kind of the cultural context and what was actually happening. But in terms of language, I think many practitioners, especially those who are not bilingual, make the assumption, for instance, that anyone who speaks Spanish can translate, legal Spanish, which is just incorrect, right? And so I saw on many occasions instances where, an error in a word created incredible confusion, which impacted the rapport that one could establish with their attorney, which impacted the way that, what they were saying was translated. And here's an example. I met with a man in arraignments once who was being accused of assault, and he had been told upon his arrest in this kind of broken translation that he was being accused in Spanish of asalto, which is armed robbery. And he had absolutely no idea what was happening. And so everything that he then said seemed to make absolutely no sense, both to his advocate, even though it was being translated, and also obviously what he had said to the police in that circumstance. And that seems like a very small problem, but in fact it can create tremendous complications for people as they go through the system. The same is true when they're asked to sign things like orders of protection that they cannot read. When they're thinking about or having explained to them some of the collateral consequences with respect to either family court or housing court or immigration. I've watched legal proceedings where there's supposed to be simultaneous translation, and I know it's not happening. And I know that there are whole pieces of the proceeding that this person is not hearing, let alone, with respect to what they are hearing, trying to kind of process the legalese, which if you've ever had the misfortune of being, a party to a criminal case, we as attorneys tend to use terms that only we understand in the process of the court. And so when you think about adding the translation element to that, with sometimes 3 people speaking at the same time, you realize just how much is being lost. Essentially, folks are not getting the same quality representation that their counterparts are receiving.
And that's certainly, I think, easy to see that justice isn't being served in such cases. I think with some of the things that are being played out here in our conversation already is just how painting with a broad brush just won't work with these issues. But we're talking about individuals, and they're coming from different circumstances. Michelle, I want to ask you, just before we turn to social media questions and questions from the audience, about another situation that we've been hearing a lot about in the news, and that's with TPS recipients. And they come with just a different circumstance as well. Could you explain to us what they're?
Sure. So, of course, like I mentioned, there are so many different groups of immigrants who are really under siege right now. And those who have temporary protected status, TPS, are among those. So, and those who have TPS are from Nepal, Sudan, obviously El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua. So those from El Salvador, Honduras, they've had temporary protected status since 1999, El Salvador since 2001. So we just are now telling these individuals who have been here since then, continuously, that they have to just get up and go. They have U.S. citizen children. They've made it their whole entire lives here. They are, as Valentina said, part of the community. They are hopefully getting the types of services that Seton Hall and Stephanie provide. They are part of this community, right? And we are now telling them, no, you've got to pick up and leave because we don't want to extend more temporary protected status to your country, despite, again, knowing that the conditions there are not great for El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua to take back the individuals. And the other thing that I want to mention with those who have temporary protected status and beyond them, but a lot of them with temporary protected status, DACA too, there is this phenomenon that I wanted to mention because Valentina talked about the language and the importance of language. And so, as you mentioned, it's interesting, the civil law and common law and the difference between that. It's just, we don't even think about it because we just maybe lived in the United States under a common law type of system, but most immigrants come from the majority of the world, which is civil law. So civil law societies, really, they come from these countries, and that's quite a difference. Well, let me tell you a difference in words. So if you come from a civil law type of country, so Latin America, right? Notario is synonymous to an attorney. But here in the United States, a notario is a notary public. Well, there are individuals out in the community who know that this difference in language between civil law and common law societies exists, and they use that to prey on the communities and to really take from them their resources, their money, and say, I am an attorney, I am a notario, and I can fix your immigration case. And at the end of the day, what they end up doing is completely damaging, often putting them in actual deportation proceedings as a result. And it's really oftentimes, and this happened to me because prior to working at Clinic, I worked at Catholic Charities of Washington, D.C. I would see so many people coming into the office hoping that we could fix this case that was completely just undone by a notario, and hoping that we would do it for fairly, cheap, because they had spent so much money on these notarios who had preyed upon them. And luckily we were able to do that, but that takes a lot of resources from, for example, Clinic's network of nonprofits that are always there, and we hope that they're always there. But this is just one example that Valentina brought to mind when we talk about civil law, common law, language, and then the things that we may not, we just take for granted because we maybe have lived here all of our lives and never thought about going to another country and seeing those little differences.
I want to make sure that we leave time also to ask, I'd like to ask you three about possible solutions or how we can start moving toward solutions, because it seems like on some of these issues, on some of the issues with criminal justice reform, I think we're starting to see positive developments. But then in other issues like immigration, seems like there's a complete impasse. So I want to make sure that we return to some questions if they don't come up from our audience about ways that we can take this conversation and move toward possible solutions. But I'm just going to check to see if we've got some social media questions very quickly here. I'm not checking the Met score, just for the record. So, okay, let's see. Okay, this question. I've lost it. It's a really great question. Okay, so here's the question for Michelle. But if anyone wants to jump in, of course, more than welcome to do so. If you don't like Michelle's answer, please do. Okay, probably a very serious question that shouldn't be introduced with a joke. Let's see. Let's see how this goes. What is the most helpful piece of practical advice for us as faithful Catholics if we are looking to help those at the border? It seems daunting, and it seems like many may not know where to begin to help.
Yeah, it's a great question, and yes, please, I would love for both Stephanie and Valentina to add to this. So the border right now, obviously that's what's in the news. Of course, the emergency, urgent situations are really right outside our door because they live here and they're being told that there's going to be enforcement at their homes, at their work at any day. So that's happening here. We can't put that aside because there are emergency situations here. But at the border, since that is really front and center right now, there are a couple of things. And so Clinic, we have had a staff member in Tijuana for months now, and he has set up the Know Your Rights and the volunteer infrastructure for a fabulous organization called Al Otro Lado. And so he's been on the ground just welcoming the volunteers, getting the Know Your Rights, the information to those asylum seekers who are stranded in Tijuana. That's one way of helping. And we will be at Clinic rolling out the next few months a project in Ciudad Juarez to do the same thing, but to actually go a little bit further, because what's happening in Ciudad Juarez as a result of these border policies is that the families are going through their immigration hearing in El Paso. So Department of Homeland Security takes them from the bridge when they show up, and then they take them to the immigration court in El Paso, and there they tell the family, we need to see your asylum application. And then they take the family back to Juarez, let's say. They don't have anything. They're on the street, basically, right? They don't have any resources to help them fill out an asylum application in English. So it's, you know, this Kafka, it's just a crazy situation that we, and the hurdles that we're putting before asylum seekers. So we're gonna be starting a project in the next few months, hopefully in Ciudad Juarez, that's in the works. And so stay tuned for that. Those will be some volunteer opportunities for faithful Catholics, like the person who's asking the question, and others too. I mean, whoever you want, if you just recognize human dignity and you think that we should be doing more and that we stand for more and for better, then yes, we welcome everybody to come to either of those two projects.
For the Catholic college students that approach the center and the Institute for direction, we drive them towards the organizations that are on the ground doing the field work and are in the trenches. We also ask them to break down the stigma and to create dialogue and in their own circles talk about the issues. And I've been witness to students calling out on the word illegal and unpacking it and talking to each other and their peers. At this age, they are ripe for activism and they want to contribute, and it's imperative really for their growth and to be future citizens of this country. So I would encourage people to keep listening, to keep talking, to keep creating dialogue within each other. And then also at Seton Hall University, we dug deep into our research and our archives, and we learned that Monsignor Fay, past president of Seton Hall University, actually held a migrant worker symposium, again in 1974. It was a very progressive year for Seton Hall University. Monsignor Fay enacted the Puerto Rican Institute at Seton Hall. He also started the Africana Studies Department. He also started the Seton Hall Law School and chose to put it in Newark. And when we brought that forward to the campus community, people were proud, incredibly proud to know that their university was at the forefront of the marginalized migrant community at the time. That is why Dolores Huerta visited us in 1974 and we invited her back. And that's why we gave an honorary degree to Chavez, Cesar Chavez, the iconic Mexican-American labor rights activist. It's because it's within our Catholic social teaching to reach out to the marginalized. And it was a great identifier and embodiment for the students at that age and when they're ready to take charge of their lives.
Yeah, and I guess I would chime in to say that I think people should contact their representatives, their senators. There's a huge, the policy impact cannot be understated. I mean, we are currently now, for instance, with respect to bail reform, passing laws in the state of New York because we have receptive politicians that are willing to step up and make a commitment to listen and to act. And I think that that sentiment, whether it's outrage, concern, et cetera, needs to be broadcast not just in major cities and certain pockets, but across the country. You know, I think in terms of faithful Catholics, the idea of children being separated from their families, especially in the way that they are and kept in the conditions that they are being kept in, the impact of that trauma, of this kind of disappearance of people is something that we should be incredibly concerned about, to say the least. And I think if you're thinking about the power of a community of faith and the voice of that community, now's the time. Now's the time to raise your voice and to say that this is not acceptable. And that this is not something that should be ongoing, that this is not a precedent that should be set or anything that should be maintained. There are certain things that should absolutely never happen, and these are those very things.
I want to ask, we got one more question here, probably more than one more, but I'm going to go to one more from social media. But if you do have a question here in the audience, we'll turn to you right after this. Just signal Nick, for the microphone, and we'll get to that question right after this one from social media. And you bear with me. You may not believe this, but I usually don't operate this device when I'm holding a microphone. But okay, so this is one from Facebook. The separation of children from the parents at the border, does that stem from the Obama administration?
So, having worked in this field for a while, I can tell you that there were some families who were separated during the Obama administration. There weren't many, there were some, and advocacy and our efforts to push back, they actually ended up working, but it was not an actual policy. And what was also not happening was the foundation for family separation that we saw in these policies. So what was the foundation of family separation is that we criminalized immigration more. So I brought up the whole, these are civil detention. Anybody, everybody deserves human dignity, right? So not to say that there's a difference in that, but just because most Americans see like, oh, you're a criminal, or like in these sorts of things in certain news channels and out in the open or whatever people say, right? So the foundation for the family separation crisis and policy was that DHS, Department of Homeland Security, would send the parents off for actual criminal prosecution for illegal entry or illegal re-entry. And because they were sending the parent to prosecution, they would then say, and the child is now an unaccompanied minor that we had to now send to the Department of Health and Human Services. And that was the whole foundation for the separation, is really because they decided to bring prosecutions against parents, which is not something that has happened generally in the past, and it's been escalating and escalating more and more, especially under this administration. So yes, the answer is there were some under the Obama administration. It was not a policy. In those cases that we knew about, there was actual success stories in making sure that the families would be reunited after.
Can I just say something about this? Because I want to be clear about my comment. I don't think this is a Republican or a Democratic issue. I think that this is a very human issue. And I can speak from a personal place now, having been raised a Catholic, having been educated a Catholic, and what echoes in my head is, what you do to the least of my brothers, you do to me. And that doesn't matter if a Republican does it, if a Democrat does it, if an independent does it. It should not be done. You don't do this to people. I mean, that, I think, is at the very core and fabric of the faith that Catholics profess, right? This idea of human dignity, that we are greater than the sum of all of the possible terrible things we could have done, all of the bad decisions we could have made. And I don't mean to say in any way that when you pick up your family and you leave a situation that you know to be dangerous, looking for something else, that's a terrible decision. But whatever you think about that, the response should still, you should find it in yourself. The response should be one of love first, right? When we're looking at addressing and thinking about a problem involving human beings, and especially involving children, that there has to be a point where we say, whoever's doing this, it needs to stop.
Absolutely. I believe we have a question here at the back.
Here in Hudson County, they have had a long-standing agreement with the Hudson County Jail to accept detainees. And recently, there's been a lot of opposition and trying to force the county to end the contract with ICE, more out of animosity toward what ICE is doing and you just described. On the other hand, I'm a little conflicted because some immigration advocates say it's better for people to be local. And certainly the Hudson County Jail is a much newer building. I worked there for 2 years. It's a jail, but it's much better than the Elizabeth Detention Center, which was a factory that doesn't even have windows in many places. So I'm interested to hear your take on this, because some people feel that they went too far to force the county to stop the contract, because then it would mean people have to go farther away from their home, and family and advocates can't visit them.
Excellent question.
I mean, you said Elizabeth. The last time I practiced criminal defense was over 10 years ago, and you know, I would get calls from people who were in New York, who were then transferred to the custody of you know, what was then INS, and we're in Elizabeth, and the stories that came out of that jail were horrific. I mean, there was use of dogs to intimidate people. I mean, so just listening to that gives me kind of a visceral response. But I would say it is incredibly, this is kind of like being, and you know, Michelle can talk more about this, but this is like being stuck between a rock and a hard place, right? It is imperative that people be close to their families, close to their advocates with respect to you know, any kind of defense, whether that's in criminal justice or certainly in immigration. What I found was that many of my clients, again, when I was practicing, and now what I do is kind of function more as a service provider and think about alternatives, but you know, people would be transferred into federal custody, into, you know, immigration custody, and then get lost. People couldn't find them. They didn't know where they were. They were being sent to, you know, Texas, or being sent to other jurisdictions where there was greater likelihood of removal. And it certainly created tremendous difficulty for their advocates and for their families. So I think this is a very difficult situation.
Yes, and I think something to keep in mind is that in the immigration system, you can be transferred anywhere. So just because you might start off locally doesn't mean that they can't just pick you up and transfer you somewhere else really far away from your home. So that's a consideration to take, and we have seen this play out where communities have been very successful fighting back against getting jails built or having new ICE contracts at the existing jails. But if we all did that respectively everywhere, then there wouldn't really be any place to send people, right? It'd be great for us to do that type of advocacy and just kind of shut it all down and think about what Valentina was saying, these alternatives to detention, because they exist. They exist in immigration and in the criminal justice system. In fact, the family case management system, which was used for mothers who were released from family detention, extremely, extremely successful. They were showing up to their hearings. That got wiped out under this administration as an alternative. One consideration as a point of advocacy to take away, if you're going to keep the jail local, and of course think the broader scheme and what it says to people in the community and the effect it has psychologically to have a jail in your neighborhood, right, and your vicinity. But besides that, and those very real psychological impacts, think about talking to the, again, politicians, your leaders, about a system where if they're going to take that ICE money, that maybe they can then use that ICE money to provide legal representation for the people held there. So they would take the money from the ICE contract, but they would actually be feeding it into helping people who are detained there by helping to have representation, which is not given to those in immigration custody. They have to go out and find their own representation, right, their legal representation, and it's very expensive, and that's why we take our job so seriously at Clinic, because the nonprofit legal service providers are really the public defenders of the civil immigration system.
I want to ask too, with that, thank you for that excellent question again. But also, you know, recently in America, we've been following very closely the developments with the DREAM Act. And then many of my colleagues are coming out of the university and have attended their friends, their family members are dreamers. They've gone to the university with that. And I think that this, in a way, really exemplifies a kind of the impasse when it comes to legislation in Congress and just the divisiveness of the issue itself. Stephanie, can I ask you, I know actually you mentioned to me before that St. Peter's has a wonderful program here for undocumented students, but just from a university's perspective, how are students dealing with this? And I mean, it seems like that's just a constant state of limbo.
Right, we'd be remiss to not mention the Center for Undocumented Students here at St. Peter's University. They provide the wraparound services that we provided, and also the guidance, the advisement, and the psychological services and mentoring. Because what I'm hearing most from our students is that it's a heavy load, and with the school priorities, they still are the non-traditional student in many ways. So they're commuters. They're coming and probably being caretakers in their homes, or they're attending their family's business. And so it's great that St. Peter's is progressive and had the foresight to know that they have a 40% Latino student population, so they now started to bring about more innovative programming. And I actually, if you take the liberty of reading from their ceremony that I caught on video, and it moved me because it made me feel very proud to be part of this Catholic University network. And at the TICAS, which I believe is the affectionate name for this center, they said, "What then does a university do immersed in this reality? Transform it? Yes. Do everything so that liberty and victories over oppression, justice over oppression, love over hate. Without this overall commitment, we would not be a university, and even less so, we would not be a Catholic university." So it's this moral imperative to serve your students and your student population. And again, great work to St. Peter's for bringing this center forward, and for the Dreamers and the DACA students within their network.
Thank you for sharing that with us, and for sharing that with our audience online. This is obviously just the beginning, or the continuation, really, of the conversation that we've been having now for years. We're so grateful for the three of you in your work every day, certainly, and in the good work that you do, recognizing human dignity in those that you serve, but also especially tonight for being with us and sharing your wisdom with all of us here. We only have the chance to take one question from the audience, unfortunately, because we have to kind of wrap things up here for the live stream. But there will be chances to ask more questions. We have a little bit of some food and some snacks here. For those of you on the live stream, sorry, you should have made the effort to come out, but. It's great. It's not a banquet, but we have some snacks and refreshments for you afterwards, and we can. Those of us that are here present, we can continue that conversation here. But once again, I want to thank all of you that took the time to come out here tonight. It really is. I think we can all recognize how important these issues are for our country, and certainly for our church. And again, once again, thank you very much, and thanks to all of those who tuned in online.
Thank you.
Thank you.